Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture on Victorian detective fiction. This week we're going to be talking about two short stories written during the Victorian era. The first is The Diary of Anne Rodway by Wilkie Collins, and the second is The Man with the Twisted Lip by Arthur Conan Doyle. We're going to be looking at these two stories both in terms of how they connect to the uncanny, that element of Todorov's theories of the fantastique, but then also in terms of the cultural work that they were doing during the Victorian era and their importance to the 19th century. So let's get started. So to give you some historical context, what you need to know is that prior to the Victorian era, the typical British sentiment about crime was that crime will out. Basically what this means is that evil will always be discovered and punished because of the general morality of the universe as assumed by people in England. So their feelings were that if a crime was committed, you didn't really have to go looking for who did it because eventually the universe or God or divine will would expose and then punish the person who had committed the crime. So there was this sense that there would be moral justice kind of embedded into the outworking and the structure of the way that the world works. And basically what happens in the 19th century was shifting understanding of the length of time and history and the way that the universe is formed. All of this kind of leads people to begin to realize that perhaps crime will not out, that there isn't a moral structure to the universe that would just necessarily expose crime if it happened, but that people actually had to go look for who to convict in crimes, and they had to try to figure out how justice could be enacted for people. So once people discovered this, there became this sort of anxious time during the Victorian time period, and that led to this new anxiety in the culture about a criminal philosophy. Basically, and Wilkie Collins talks about this in his novel, The Woman in White, which we're not reading, but he's the same author of The Diary of Anne Rodway. And he talks about how only foolish crimes would be discovered because an intellectual criminal could plan and plot and get away with things. And when this, went through the culture, a lot of readers and then people began to pick up on this, and people began to be really worried that, hey, if we're not actually having criminals pursued, they could just do evil and get away with it and no one would be the wiser. So a lot of different authors use this to their advantage to create suspense with feelings of criminals who were masterminds or people who could manipulate laws and situations in order to pull off crimes. And you see this really as a trope that still exists today in literature and film. Some of the important historical developments to note is that in 1856, the Police Bill Act was passed, which actually created the modern police force as we know it. Prior to that time period in England, you didn't have what we would consider to be a recognizable police force. Alongside this, in 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act meant that men and women could be divorced without having to prove that it was the woman's fault instead of the man's fault. So women could hire detectives as well. So private detectives became a thing for the first time. So instead of having private disputes solved kind of under the table, so to speak, they were actually allowed to bring cases to court, and private disputes became cause for public scrutiny. Things were more published in the paper. People could hire private detectives to follow one another, and these scandals that used to be family affairs became exposed to the public. This also became fodder for literature. So these two things, the formation of the Police Act and the Matrimonial Causes Act, contributed to the way that people began to think about crime, scandal, secrets, how to expose those secrets, and the role of police and culture as well. So while this is a really simplistic overview of the historical context, I just wanted you to have a basic background to know that things were changing in regards to the police force, to detection, and to the way that people were looking for information, whether that is private information that you would use to petition for divorce, or whether that was public information that would be used to solve a crime. So again, the Matrimonial Causes Act and the Police Act are more complex and really more interesting if you want to get into those historically, but we're going to be looking at them through the lens of literature. So we're going to move now to thinking in terms of how fiction in particular used the historical circumstances to then offer a type of social critique. So detective fiction is created in the 19th century for a variety of reasons, but this is one of those reasons, that there was the formation of the police force, detectives became a thing for the first time, and authors took up these figures that were now present in the public and imagined stories about what it would be like to pursue cases and to enact justice against particularly intelligent criminals for the first time. So while entertaining, detective fiction is doing a lot of other cultural work. It's also allowing outsider figures to cross these sort of taboo boundaries of Victorian society that aren't normally permeable. So Victorian society is very rigid, it's very structured, particularly in terms of gender and class. So those two things don't often mix. Whether it's men mixing with women in public, that doesn't usually happen. Men tend to stay in the public sphere, women tend to stay in the private sphere. There's not a lot of crossover there happening. Also, lower class tends not to mix with upper class, particularly not for personal relationships, right? There's not going to be a lot of camaraderie between the classes. So when you look at something like detective fiction, what you're going to see is actually the way that these boundaries start to blur a little bit. Detective fiction is allowing lower class and upper class people to mix. It's allowing women more freedom from restrictive gender roles. And by women in particular taking on the figure of a detective, they're able to do things that they normally wouldn't be able to do in polite society. So the problem with the cultural work that detective fiction can do is that social critique can be undermined, mainly because detective fiction is ultimately comforting. So while there's this great anxiety in Victorian culture about criminals and unsolved crime, when you read a detective story, 9 times out of 10, the detective is solving the case. The criminal is being punished. So detective fiction is working to relieve any sort of anxiety about a lack of justice because the crime is solved. So that's where that pleasure comes from. And of course, when you have something that's relieving anxiety rather than leaving you with it, it's comforting, it's pleasurable, but it also tends to draw your attention away from any real social critique that might have happened there, because the emphasis is more on pleasure and closure than it is on thoughtfulness about the issues that were raised. What you'll see in a lot of detective fiction is that the belief in forensic science is now almost like the belief in the prior moral virtue of the universe, that crime would out. But now crime is going to out not because of this sort of moral guidance of the universe, but because of the scientific superiority of the detective or the police force or whoever's doing this hunting down of the criminal. Through logic, through deduction, those Enlightenment values are going to be superior and are going to help bring justice to the community and to the nation. So let's look at our first example of detective fiction. The first story that I asked you to read was The Diary of Anne Rodway, which was written by Wilkie Collins. It was originally published in Charles Dickens's periodical Household Words in 1856. Collins and Dickens were actually good friends and were very interested in the same types of literature, although Dickens tended to write a little more in the realist vein and the sentimental, while Collins was more known for sensationalist writings. Collins in particular, his backstory is that he was a lawyer and he was very interested in this idea of how testimony constructs truth. So he would go down to the courts and he would listen to testimonies, and he thought a lot about how one person's testimony gave one side of the truth and another person's gave another side and then another person's, and that the truth had to be then constructed in this middle space between all these different points of view. And he actually took this into his fiction writing as a narrative strategy. So if you read something like The Woman in White, his novel that I mentioned earlier, it's composed of all these different testimonies, and you as a reader are supposed to then reconstruct what happened. He also wrote The Moonstone, which is considered to be one of the first full-length detective novels in England, and it is also constructed of multiple testimonies while someone tries to hunt down the theft of a jewel and what happened. In this particular story, it's considered to be one of the first detective short stories in England, and it was collected as the final story of a book, The Queen of Hearts, which was published in 1859. That's the text that you're reading from, so you'll see that it's actually quite a longer narrative, and then the section that you're reading is the narrative of Diary of Anne Rodway, which is a story that's told by a brother to entertain a young woman. So we can think about the context of that, how the story of detection and all these cultural issues that are going to be raised within it, as we'll see, are still contained in publication in this rather benign novel form that's just supposed to be pleasurable entertainment. So it kind of does away or neutralizes any sense of cultural critique that could come from the fiction. So I think it's important for us to note that even though detective fiction can be progressive in terms of blurring these strict Victorian boundaries, it's also very restrained in what the author and the audience were really expecting it to do. So for that reason, I've titled the next couple of slides with question marks on them. Critique of social class, possibly, and critique of gender, possibly. When we read a story like this, it's easy for us to want to read in our own interpretations from a 21st century perspective. But I do think that Wilkie Collins was playing here with narrative, particularly first-person constrained narrative, where we're only getting things through Anne's perspective. She's keeping a diary. The form of the story takes the form of a diary, and we're really reliant on her perspective for us to understand the context and the situation. Obviously, this means that we're building suspense because of her limited point of view. That helps us not know everything that's happening because we're only seeing it from the times that she decides to write in her diary. And you even see some of those missing pages where there's nothing happening and you wonder, why isn't she writing? What's happened? That's supposed to build some type of suspense. It also gives us questions where we don't really know for sure whether or not Anne is commenting on these particular social issues, and then by extension, whether or not Wilkie Collins wants us to investigate for ourselves the particular issues that are being raised in the text about social class and about gender. So for our purposes, I'm going to just raise those questions with our class, and we can decide and discuss through some of our discussion forums how we feel about the cultural work that the story could possibly be doing. So the first one, again, is the critique of social class. So when we read the story, what we learned first is that Mary's death is initially blamed on her middle-class employers. Because they work her too hard, she faints and is carelessly sent home alone. So because of this, we're led to believe that there is this class tension and that the middle class is to blame rather than the lower class. So the suggestiveness here is that perhaps the class structure is part of the problem, particularly the working circumstances of the working class and how the working class is being exploited and even abused, and that the middle class, and then by extension the upper class, are indifferent to the working class's suffering. But what we find, and again, hopefully you've read the stories before you're listening to this lecture, is that ultimately her death is due to someone from her own class. So what happens is that this potential critique of the working condition is raised, but then any anxiety that a middle class reader might have about their own complicity in this problem is erased by the end of the story. So ultimately, her death is due to the working class as well. So if I'm a middle class reader, then I can feel relieved. Oh, it's not really my fault. It was actually somebody from the lower class. And you know, those lower class people, they prey on one another, right? They're hurting one another. It's not really my fault. This is what a middle class reader who would be a purchaser of something like Queen of Hearts by Wilkie Collins, they would feel relieved at the end of it, right? That they're exonerated from any sense of anxiety. But that anxiety is used within the story for suspense, right? It causes a sensation in the reader. So again, we have to wonder, is Collins really concerned about the social impact of the class system, or is he just manipulating that anxiety that middle class readers might feel in order to generate a sensation and to sell books? So it's a little cynical perspective, but we need to be thinking through the motivations here and whether or not there's really any cultural impact that's happening, or whether this is just a literary text that's meant to draw out particular feelings in readers and then assuage those feelings. Another place where there's possibly a critique of social class or just some interesting social class movement happens at the story's conclusion. Justice in this particular story includes class promotion. So what happens, you'll remember, is that Mary's brother gets her fiance Robert a good job, and he and gets Anne, Robert's fiance, a good job, and he and Anne become part of the middle class. So she no longer has to work anymore, so she is elevated and receives a very material reward for punishing the murderer. So in this case, what you have is that detection here and figuring out the answer to Mary's death actually results in financial stability for she and for Robert, for Anne and for Robert. So detective fiction is basically saying if you do the right thing, if you're good, if you're moral, if you're a good person, then you will be rewarded in actual real ways, material ways. And it seems that progression to the middle class is that reward. Again, undermining any sort of critique about Mary's employers that might have been alluded to in the opening of the text. So there is this kind of balancing act that Collins is doing with using social class both to create a plot, but not necessarily to do any progressive cultural work, perhaps. But he has raised the issue. He's drawn attention to it. And whether or not readers decide to make anything of that is really up to them. I mentioned earlier that detective fiction also allows characters to transgress gender boundaries in ways that are unexpected. Now, Anne isn't a traditional detective because, first of all, she's female. But second of all, at this point in time when Collins was writing, there wasn't really a genre of detective fiction completely codified yet. It wasn't something that people would have necessarily recognized and marketed in terms of, hey, this is the next detective book or story that's coming out. It was really the birth of that. So he's one of the first writers. Anne is one of the first types of characters who are doing detective work, even though they're not necessarily detectives themselves. So you'll remember that as she goes through this investigation, she's having to act alone. And again, that's one of the things that detectives do. Typically, they might have a junior partner like a Watson to a Holmes, but they're also usually solitary figures. In this case, the reason for that is because her fiance is in America. So she's acting alone and then trying to, take up the cause of her friend because nobody else is interested in it. So I wanted to point out a few examples of how she's actually breaking some of the traditional gender boundaries that would have restricted her. She does this in a variety of ways, which I've listed here on the slide. She's going to turn conversations to her advantage. She's going to raise money. She does lie about doing charring work when necessary. She's speaking very boldly to the cabman and in what would be considered a very masculine way. And she uses male figures to get evidence, both through the doctor and to protect her when she talks to the beadle. So all of these things are actually situations where normally it wouldn't be okay for Anne to do these things. She wouldn't be going out on her own into like a not so nice part of town and lying about things and talking to cabmen and trying to figure out information. This is just not something a respectable woman in Victorian society would do. But it's okay and it's excused by the fact that she has justice on her side and that she's doing this moral work of being a detective. So in going out and trying to solve Mary's murder, she's actually allowed to transgress and do these things because she doesn't have anybody else to help her. And it's necessary in order for the moral work to be done for her to do these things that wouldn't usually be okay. And what you'll see is that when Robert returns from America, Anne no longer leads the investigation. She gives it over to him. And the reason for this, it's very important in terms of Victorian gender boundaries, is because she can't be a marriageable, attractive figure to Robert if she's out there still leading the investigation and taking over everything and being out in public, right? This just wouldn't be done. So when he comes back, he assumes that leadership. He assumes the public role where he's going out and taking care of all the public side of tying up the loose ends of everything and making sure that the investigation is concluded and that Mary is taken care of in terms of justice. And that allows Anne to step back and to become a more marriageable, attractive Victorian woman to readers, and it closes off the narrative in terms of any gender transgressions that were happening up until that point. Now, Collins himself does not ask the question about what appropriate detection looks like, but the story raises for us this question of what is okay and not okay in terms of pursuing justice and truth. In this particular story, we understand that we need to have concrete details in order to prove that a crime has been committed. But the story itself is also using dreams that predict the future. And so what you see is this tension between intuition versus logic, and particularly a use of coincidence in the story. For example, Anne randomly finds the torn cravat in the store. Can we really credit her with being a detective if she just randomly finds it? Even the story is suggesting that it was providence that she was able to solve this particular case. Now, she's not thinking of it as a case. She's thinking of it as just her friend's murder that needs to be brought to justice. And of course, we're getting this through her limited person diary, where we're not really sure how much of it is shaped for an audience versus supposed to be her true thoughts. So does she think it's really providence? That's really, do we trust her as a narrator or not? That's an open question. Did she really find it randomly? We have to take her word for it. So Collins isn't really telling us for sure because we don't have anything external to Anne's diary in order to know what anybody else thinks about it. The reason that I bring this up in terms of appropriate detection is because all of this tension between intuition and logic is really closely connected to gender and to class. So in particular with gender, it would be much too masculine for Anne to actually just take charge and go out hunting for the torn cravat. It would be much too masculine for her to go in and demand that someone hand it over. She just happens to find it because this is a softened way to say that a woman has been successful with doing something that a man refused to do or couldn't do. So it allows her to navigate those strict gender boundaries without necessarily coming across both to readers and to the other characters within the text as being too out of the ordinary, right? So it's okay for her to transgress, but we don't want her, or Collins is suggesting perhaps, that we don't want her to go too far across those boundaries. We're also connecting this to class. Anne has to work and she does not have time to pursue an investigation full time. So the use of coincidence and dreams and intuition are much more feminine and much more acceptable than someone who can just become, or I should say than men who can just become full-time detectives, who can go out into the public sphere, who can just go up to people and say, "Hi, I'm a working detective. Tell me what's going on here." A woman could never do this in the Victorian time period. And Anne is having to earn money, but she could never actually earn her money as a professional detective. So she's restricted in terms of gender, but so her working class actually forces her to have to spend most of her time working in order to earn enough money to live. So she can't actually pursue justice the same way that a middle-class man would be able to do. So talking about the story in terms of what appropriate detection looks like, for Anne, being a working-class female, this is the way to get around those problems in Victorian culture. Use intuition, use dreams, have her just be able to happen upon these things, and she still maintains a respectable demeanor, and Collins can bring the story to a conclusion in a way that promotes middle-class values and doesn't threaten middle-class readers with any more anxiety about gender and class. Nevertheless, those things have been raised. Even though he closes those things off at the end, they are still there in the story, and we have to ask ourselves, how effective are they? Did we really respond to those things as we were reading? Let's move on to our second story now so that we can look at the issues of gender and class, but from the perspective of how Victorian men would have been affected. The Man with a Twisted Lip is written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and it's one of his Sherlock Holmes stories, so it does involve Holmes as an active detective figure. It's written later than Diary of an Anne Rodway. So at that point, Holmes had already developed, and really culturally, there was more knowledge of detectives as particular figures in culture and then now in literature. So where Anne was working more at the beginning of detective fiction's development, Holmes is more established, and he's really considered to be, still even today, one of the most recognizable detectives in all of literature. So The Man with the Twisted Lip is looking at a particular case where Holmes begins in an opium den investigating, and Watson has gone in to help retrieve one of his friends and bring him back to his wife because he's gone missing due to drug use. And Holmes is there undercover. And what we see immediately is a pretty big difference between the work that Holmes is able to do versus the work that Anne was able to do. And really what I want us to ask as we go through this story and comparing it to Diary of Anne Rodway is, what is acceptable for Victorian men? So in these very restrictive gender roles in the Victorian time period, the public sphere was considered to be the active sphere for men. They were really not involved in the running of households. They were public agents and out running the world, basically. So women were not supposed to be going into public places without assistance. And you see this immediately in something like The Twisted Lip, because Mrs. Whitney goes and asks Watson, hey, can you help me find my husband? I think he's at this opium den, but I can't go there. She even says this, right? Like, how could I possibly, as a respectable woman, go out into this public place, in particular a bad public place, and retrieve my husband? I need to go with you. And then she even says, actually, why don't you just go without me? I'll go home and you take care of this problem for me in the world. This was much more the traditional way that you would see men and women acting in society in the Victorian time period. So women are going to turn their problems over to the active agents and let them solve them. And this actually happens in the second repeated story of a missing husband, when you get the story of St. Clair and his wife thinking that she saw him through the window and then needing help tracking him down and figuring out what happened. She doesn't do it herself like Anne did, right? She hires someone to help her do it, and Holmes takes over the case. So what you have for men is the fact that there is a very big amount of pressure on having a public image that as this active agent. They're supposed to be out there in the world doing some kind of respectable work. Not doing respectable work brings shame for them and their families, their wives, their children. There's this sense of a fear of scandal. So there's an enormous amount of pressure on Victorian men to be doing work that is considered respectable, honorable, and to be taking care of themselves and their families. So while they are having a more public role than women were, they also have a lot more pressure to perform publicly for other men and to show that they are doing things in the world that are worthy of renown. So the role of work is keenly tied to gender for men in particular. Victorian men are these active agents, and they need to show that type of self-importance through the work that they choose to do. For the upper class, leisure is acceptable and it's expected because to work means that you don't have enough money. If you're really upper class, then you don't need to work. You're more involved in politics and in directing other people to work and taking care of your giant mansion and all your horses and all your grounds. And you're not necessarily having to do any actual labor of any kind. If you were, then you would be considered middle class. But even in the middle class, the type of work that you choose is supposed to reflect on your moral character. So the better type of work in terms of justice is going to be a higher calling for men than doing something like owning a pub. Right, so this would be lower middle class, if not working class. So the scale in terms of what men were doing and how they chose to spend their time commented publicly on the type of person that people thought that they were. So there was definitely judgment and assumptions about the type of person you were based on the type of job that you hold. So we see this becoming a point of conflict in The Twisted Lip because of St. Clair's choices. And again, it's important that you've read the story before I continue talking, because I am going to have the spoiler. We do learn that St. Clair has been disguising himself as Hugh Boone, and that he has been posing as a beggar. So he basically leaves his nice property and his respectable family. He goes to the opium den. He changes into his disguise. He goes down and sits on the street corner and begs all day. He earns all of this money because people feel sorry for him. He goes back, changes, goes home, and nobody is the wiser about how he's earning this money. So what the story is essentially doing is raising, again, these issues of class and how they are tied to gender as a point of anxiety that has to be detected and overcome within the context of this story. So I have these questions here about what is it asking us, or what is it indicating about the importance of work for men? Is the story a critique of the need for honest work, or does the conclusion indicate that St. Clair should conform to societal expectations? Because you'll remember at the end, he basically has to renounce this, right? He's spared public shame, but he has to renounce what he's doing and be more respectable. So the conclusion is, you're not allowed to cheat the system. You're not allowed to go and pretend to be of a different class than you are. You have to do respectable work and be part of the Victorian system that already exists. Again, this provides that closure and that relief of anxiety for things being out of place, the transgressions that are happening with a man who is not fitting in to the pattern that's expected from Victorian society. He's broken the rules. He's doing something that's taboo. And the detective fiction is comforting because it figures this out and brings him back into something that is normal and closes off that potential for anxiety. So it's, again, doing the same thing as Collins' story in terms of raising questions about those structures that are in place, but then also not really addressing them in active ways that would necessarily make a cultural point, using it more for entertainment than for change, if that makes sense. I want us to end this week by tying this discussion of detective fiction back to Todorov's theories, particularly in terms of how detective fiction is uncanny. So you'll remember in Todorov's scheme that we might experience hesitation about what is real, and then we make a decision, landing either in the uncanny or in the marvelous. Detective fiction is always going to be uncanny, because if we have any hesitation at all about what is real, it's always ending with a realistic explanation. So if you think of something like The Diary of Anne Rodway, where Anne's instincts and all of these coincidences are leading her places, she can say that she's having dreams and perhaps providence and supernatural things are guiding her. In the end, she still ends up with realistic evidence that solves a crime. In Holmes's deductions, he's always relying on close analysis and insights that others overlook. This is a form of almost extreme realism that is going to disprove any sort of mystical or supernatural explanations that could be happening. So even if things appear to be unsolvable by other than supernatural means, what you will find is that detective fiction is always going to show you some realistic explanation that you just hadn't considered yet. Another form of this comes up with Gothic fiction that is a different type of early 19th century fiction, usually in novels, where things like ghosts and vampires might be present. And we find out in the end it was actually someone dressing up in stage costumes in order to scare people out of a mansion that they wanted to buy, right? So we might believe at first that the supernatural is happening, but actually in the end it's uncanny, and it's revealed that a realistic explanation is really what's behind it all. So probably the modern equivalent would be Scooby-Doo, where it seems like supernatural things are happening, but it always ends up being someone who's been introduced earlier as a character who's responsible for it and who's sad that they didn't get away with it because they got investigated. So this type of deduction, again, detective fiction is always going to lead us through this possible moment of doubt, but land us squarely in the uncanny with a realistic answer. Of course, obviously, there can be exceptions to this if you have false evidence or unreliable testimony, or in fact, if an author wants to take you for this ride and you make you think it's supernatural and then they give you the uncanny and then they lead you back to the supernatural, then there always can be different ways that detective fiction could work. But for Victorian readers, this is primarily what detective fiction would do, leading you to realistic, deductible, obvious explanations grounded in realism, and the pleasure would come from having these problems solved in unexpected but realistic ways, and in ways that are really confirming and reestablishing the status quo, despite whatever anxiety the stories might produce, whether that's through class or gender or something like the supernatural being evoked but then assuaged. All of these things are going to be eased by the end of the story with an uncanny, realistic explanation. So thanks for discussing detective fiction with me this week, and I look forward to hearing what you think.